Chapter 25. The Truth. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I threw myself into the project with Ben to keep me busy. It kept my mind occupied, and I tried to make up for the time I had spent before not holding up my end of the work. I didn't allow myself to think about cemeteries or old people who were crazy, or peppermint tea, or boys with green eyes, or dead best friends. Every time my thoughts started to wander, I immediately pulled out a notebook and started writing down ideas for new scents for the science project. Sure, we already had our main list completed, and it was a pain in the ass to scramble for a notebook in the dark at night in bed. But it was the only thing that worked. When Valentine's Day was less than a week away, I backed off working at Uncle Bob's for the weekend. I was not in the mood to see happy couples gazing into each other's eyes while sharing Sundays together. I planned to stay at home and continue my process of not thinking about anything at all. By Saturday afternoon, I was moping around the house. The weather was cold and nasty outside, and there had been thunderstorms off and on all morning. Not very conducive to a bright and shiny happy day. I really should have just climbed back into bed with some hot cocoa and a good book, but I was restless. After wandering aimlessly from window to window in the living room, I dragged myself over to the couch. Mom was reading a book there, so I flopped down next to her. I picked up the remote and started to channel surf, but it seemed to take her forever to recognize my boredom. I kept sighing dramatically after every commercial until she finally shut her book forcefully and glared at me. Okay, I get it. You're bored or upset or something. Want to talk about it? I shook my head stubbornly and kept flipping. Why don't you go to your room then? Some of us were enjoying the peace and quiet around here. I shut the TV off and crossed my arms in front of me. Mom picked up her book again and went back to her reading. Tilting my head back to gaze at the ceiling, I tried to follow one tiny crack from one end of the room to the other. It was a painfully boring exercise, but I didn't have anything else to do. I sighed again. That must have been too much for Mom, because she slammed her book shut and got to her feet. Silence just isn't silence with you, is it? Get your coat. Let's go see a movie or something. I jumped off the couch to get my jacket. Can we see something that has bombs or explosions in it? I am so not in the mood for a romantic comedy. We'll see what's there. She joined me at the door and slipped on her jacket before scooping up her keys from the small hallway table. We stepped outside and I ran to the van. The rain had stopped for a moment, but the air was still chilly. As soon as I heard those doors unlock, I scrambled up into the front seat and waited impatiently while Mom started it up. My teeth were chattering, and I quickly turned the heater up to as high as it would go. Once the interior had warmed up slightly and my nose no longer felt like it was caught in the freezer, Mom put both hands on the wheel and shifted to drive. Then she turned to face me and put it back into park. Why don't you drive today? Me? Drive? I sputtered. But I don't even have my permit yet, and you only took me out to practice in that empty parking lot like twice. She shrugged. So, your 17th birthday is coming up in a couple of months, and you'll have your permit then. Besides, it's only 15 minutes to the theater, and there aren't that many people out today. The practice will be good for you. Okay? I jumped at the chance and threw the passenger side door open. Mom switched seats with me, and I carefully adjusted my mirrors, then put on my seatbelt. Nice job, Mom told me. Now just pull out slowly and take it easy. You know the way. Looking both ways as I pulled out of the driveway, I put my blinker on, signaling a left turn. This is a piece of cake. I took my time on the side roads, but really poured on the gas when we hit Highway 9. The sign posted said 55, and I intended to make sure I hit every bit of that speed. I cruised along, hitting my speed and my stride, and glanced over at Mom. She was actually grinning and nodded at me. You're doing great, Abby. Nice driving. I smiled back. I only took my eyes off the road for a second, but that was why I didn't see it until it was too late. Straight ahead Ahead, lying in the road mere inches away, was a 2x4 with several rusty nails sticking out of it. I hit the brakes hard and swerved to the left. There was an angled curb there, and for a couple of seconds we were airborne before touching down again. I held on tight to the steering wheel, even as I heard the dull thuds, and I braked again until we came to a stop in a gravel parking lot. "What the hell was that doing in the road?" I exploded. Mom didn't say anything, but she had a sickly expression on her face. "Sorry, Mom," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to." She cut me off. "Don't worry about it, Abby. Are you all right?" At my brief nod, she glanced into the side mirror. "You did what was necessary. Once you saw that braking wasn't going to work in time, you got out of the way. It was the smartest thing to do." She sighed heavily. "Let's go look everything over and see what the damage is." I turned the engine off and slid out of my seat. Mom was already walking around to her side of the car and looking it over from top to bottom. "Everything looks fine here," she called out. I looked at my side and immediately saw it. "It's over here on my side. Both tires blew out." A sick feeling flooded my stomach. This could be really, really bad news for me and my future license. Mom came around to inspect the damage. She crouched down and looked at each tire before instructing me to pop the trunk. I did as she asked, and she went to go peer inside. "Damn it," I heard a minute later. There was a loud clunking sound, and I walked back to see what she was doing. "Well, we have a jack, but no spare," she informed me. "Not like one spare would have done us any good anyway, but that's beside the point. I told your father that we needed to replace the one we did have, and did he listen to me? No, he did not." She kept ranting, even as she pulled out her cell phone and dialed information to get the nearest tow trucks member. Then she called the insurance company to give them some information, and I heard her ranting to them too. I went to go move the board out of the road so no one else would hit it. Giving it a ferocious kick with my foot, I muttered several angry words before heading back to the car. Mom had finished making all of her phone calls, and she told me that we might as well wait inside the car since it would be a while. I heeded her advice and climbed into the passenger side, a safe distance away from the steering wheel. The rain started up again, and we sat there, huddled in miserable silence. 2 hours passed, and several more phone calls were made before the tow truck finally showed up. We stood out in the rain with him while he loaded the van up. "Guess we won't be seeing that movie after all," I said to Mom. She just rolled her eyes and told me to go get inside the tow truck. I squeezed my way around crumpled up fast food bags and a gazillion empty soda cans before Mom and the tow truck man climbed in. "So, is the repair shop close to here?" Mom asked the guy as she elbowed me over to make a little more room. He ran a greasy hand through his straggly hair before answering. "Yep, about 5 miles up the road here is Max Auto Repair." Mom breathed an audible sigh of relief. "If you could just take us over there, we'd really appreciate it." He nodded and then shifted gears as we lurched bumpily down the road. It didn't take me long to discover that 5 miles spent squeezed next to a gear shift was entirely too long for my comfort, and I happily disentangled myself when we arrived at the auto shop. Mom paid the tow truck driver, and we both hurried into a small grey rectangular building. While she went over to the parts counter, I wandered down a back hall, looking for a waiting area. I found it easily enough, but sighed in despair as I noted that all it had to offer was an old TV, a gross-looking coffee machine, and a couple of car magazines. Not exactly how I'd pictured spending my afternoon. But I took a seat and stretched my legs out over the empty orange plastic chairs next to me. I tried to ignore the scent of stale grease that permeated the air and reached for the television remote. The television had a grand total of 7 channels, and 3 of them were fuzzy. Of course, I said to the empty room. Closing my eyes, I leaned my head back against the wall behind me, pretending I was at home on our couch. Someone entered the room, and I opened my eyes to see that it was Mom. "Well," she said, "the good news is that they have our tires in stock, and it should only take about half an hour to get it. An hour and a half to get to it." I groaned. "How long will it take them to put the tires on once they get to it?" "Oh, it won't take that long, but that's not the best part. The best part is that with parts and labor it would will end up costing me $150. I groaned again, louder this time. I could envision myself doing infinite amounts of laundry and handing over portions of my paychecks from Uncle Bob for the next 5 years. I'm really sorry, Mom. I'll pay for it. I didn't mean to do it. It was a complete accident. Don't worry about it, she said. I know I'll probably regret this later, but accidents happen to everyone. I almost hopped up and hugged her right then and there. My relief was so overwhelming. Thanks, Mom. Really thanks. But I was driving pretty well before that, right? She glared at me. Don't push it. I could still have you doing a lot more dishes from now on, she warned. I shut my mouth and closed my eyes again. Whatever she wanted, just as long as I didn't have to pay for those tires. What do we have to entertain ourselves with in here? She asked. Lifting a hand, I pointed in the general direction of the TV, or at least where I thought the TV was, since my eyes were closed. A TV that gets 4 channels, some old coffee, and a couple of magazines. Her voice perked up. Magazines? I opened my eyes briefly and then shut them again. You won't want them. Not unless you secretly read Car and Driver or Auto Enthusiast. Her voice fell. Oh. I adjusted my feet and she grew silent. I kept my eyes closed, oblivious to whatever she was doing, and tried to will myself into sleep. The next thing I knew, I was jerking awake and catching myself before I slumped off the chair. I gazed sleepily around the room. I must have drifted off after all. Mom was furiously typing away on her PDA, and I yawned loudly before getting to my feet. I'm going to take a quick walk around to stretch my legs a bit, maybe see how far along they are on the car. Okay, she murmured. I left the waiting room and found my way back to the main part of the shop. Our car was still waiting to be put up on the lift, so it was bound to be a while. Exhaling loudly, I turned the corner and walked to the end of the hall, where another room appeared to be. I didn't mean to snoop or pry, but I was bored out of my mind. That had to count as extenuating circumstances or something. I poked my head into the room and saw a dark-haired man sitting behind the large desk. He was wearing mechanic's overalls, but I couldn't read the name badge sewn onto them. I knocked twice on the wood frame outside the door and waited. He looked up with a blank expression on his face, and I spoke hesitantly. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but my mom and I are waiting for our van to be fixed, and I was wondering if you had anything else to read around here. Not car-related? The man stared at me, then pointed to the corner. There's a box of old magazines. They were donated, so I don't know what's in there. I think we might have thrown in a book or two from the last time we cleaned out the shop. But you're welcome to look through it. I smiled at him and went to grab the box. Thanks. I'm sure this will help pass the time. You're very welcome, he said. Glad to be of service. The box was kind of heavy, but I managed to carry it out to the office. I only made it 3 whole steps toward the waiting room before I dropped it, though. Since there was no one else nearby, I sank to my knees to see what was inside. Digging through all kinds of magazines, including some that dated back to the 80s, I quickly realized there was a lot of crap in that box. A thick, stout book was buried near the bottom, and I picked it up, only to read Chilton's Car Guide, Toyota 1984 on the side before dropping it back in. I kept on digging. Moments later, my fingers struck something else smooth and hard, and I lifted out a dusty yearbook. It was face down, but when I turned it over, I was surprised to see that it was from White Plains High, and it was only 2.5 years old. Jackpot! I drew my legs up underneath me and sat cross-legged with my back to the wall. All of my yearbooks at home had several signatures scrawled throughout, each one wishing me various ways to have a good summer. But I noticed that this book's pages remained signature-free. Interesting. Flipping through slowly, I wasn't surprised to see that most of the pictures were dominated by the pretty people. I thumbed past them until I saw individual photos. One of the teachers in a rumpled suit and an obvious hairpiece caught my eye, and I remembered the game Kristen and I had played in history class last year. It's time for another round of Guess When Mr. Ives' toupee will fall off, I murmured to myself. You were really good at that game, Kristen. Poor Mr. Ives had been the brunt of a lot of jokes that year. Every time he'd cross the room too fast, his poorly attached hairpiece would go flopping off his head. Now he'd moved on from bad toupees to even worse hair plugs. The man obviously had no idea how cruel high schoolers could be. I shook my head, smiling at the flying toupee memory. God, that had been a fun year. I kept flipping and finally came to the last couple of pages. Sitting up straighter, I squinted my eyes as I stared at the group of seniors that heralded the end of their school years. It was a grainy black and white shot of the gymnasium right before graduation, and the faces were hard to make out. But I scanned over them, looking for Caspian. He should have been there. This was his graduating class. I searched the lines of names to the far left of the picture, closing the tiny size 4 font that they had chosen, and looked for the C's. He'd be listed there. But in between Carlotta and Cruz there was no Crane. I looked through all the C names again, thinking that I must have missed it, or it might have been misalphabetized, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Then I went line by line, skipping until I came across Caspian's name listed with the V's. They had his name down as Caspian Vender. The mistake puzzled me. Sure, he had been a new student and all, but hadn't anyone checked the school records to make sure they didn't mess up last names before they labeled the pictures? I checked the yearbook again more carefully, but I didn't see any other pictures that he was in. Then I flipped over to the senior portraits section, figuring that at least they had to be labeled correctly. But the C names listed here yielded the same results as before. They had a listing under the V's once again for a Caspian Vender, but in the little box where there should have been a picture were the words, "Sorry, no picture available." I had no way of knowing if it was really him or not. Gently closing the yearbook, I set it on my knee and rested my chin in my hand. This was weird. I didn't seriously think that there were 2 guys named Caspian who just happened to go to the same high school. It was a fairly uncommon name. Yet I distinctly recalled the Caspian that I had met telling me he'd gone to White Plains High, and his last name was Crane. There was no Caspian Crane in this yearbook. Footsteps echoing loudly in the hallway interrupted my thoughts, and I looked over to see the man that I'd talked to earlier. He had obviously just come from his office and was walking my way. I said hi automatically as he passed, but my thoughts weren't on him at all. My brain was too busy trying to sort out the pieces of this puzzle I'd stumbled upon. He gave me some type of return greeting that didn't even register with me, and took 2 more steps before stopping to turn around. I looked up at him in a daze, with the yearbook still resting on my knee. Was that yearbook in the box? He looked confused. I didn't mean for it to get put in there. I looked down at the yearbook and then back at him before even realizing he was talking to me. My brain was acting fuzzy. Yeah, I blurted out, looking over at the box. It was. My brain was back. Do you know whose it is? A small, sad smile played across his face. Yes, I do. It was my son's. For the 3rd time in my life, time froze. I could see his name tag clearly now, and it said Bill Vender. When my words came out, they slowed, distorted, like I was speaking underwater. It sounded funny even to my own ears. Your sons? He nodded, and suddenly things sped up again. Time whooshed around me, and I knew it was moving too fast. I had to slow this down, to stop it from coming, but I couldn't. He used to go to White Plains High School, the man said. He graduated almost 3 years ago. Don't ask him, Abby. Just don't ask him. What was his name? I asked him. Caspian Vender. Why? Did you know him? Did you go there too? I couldn't stop myself. No, but I think I saw him around once or twice. Blondish hair with a black streak in it, and green eyes. The man laughed, but it was a sad laugh. Yep, that's him all right. He shook his head and spoke softly, almost to himself. That damn black streak. Don't do it, Abby. Just don't do it. My brain was absolutely freaking out now, spazzing with little tiny aftershocks of thought. I didn't want to do it, but I had to know. I stuck out my hand, or rather stuck my hand up since I was still sitting on the floor. I'm Abigail Browning. Abby. He grasped my hand and shook it. Bill. So, did Caspian leave this behind when he went off to college or something? No. Don't say it. Please don't say it. He died a little more than 2 years ago in a car accident, right after Halloween. Something exploded in the back of my head and my ears actually rang from the force of it. I dropped the yearbook. I have to go now, I stuttered, stumbling to my feet. I'm sorry for your... My mom. I have to go. Blindly, I turned and felt my way back to the waiting room, holding onto the wall for support. Are you okay? He called out after me, but I ignored him. The edges of my vision were blurry and tiny white spots danced behind my eyelids when I closed them, but I held onto the wall and desperately tried not to cry. Mom was standing over by the coffee maker, doing something with the lid when I entered. Oh good, you're back, she said. They just let me know that it will be only another 20 minutes or so. I sat down numbly on the plastic chairs and pulled my knees up to my chest. I didn't say anything out loud, but my mind was screaming. When he finally came to get Mom 25 minutes later and she had paid the bill, I settled into the passenger seat of the car and stared out the window. Mom started it up and turned the radio on low before heading in the direction of home. Let's not say anything about this to your father just yet, okay, Abby? I want to tell him about it myself when he's in a good mood. I shrugged, still facing the window, and kept silent. That was fine by me. Dad and the new tires were the farthest thing from my mind right now, considering the mechanic just told me that my boyfriend was dead. The rain started pounding again right as we pulled into the driveway, and Mom made a mad dash for the front door. I stayed where I was. The rain was falling hard and fast, and I watched the big drops splatter and then roll across the windshield. I tried to collect my thoughts, but failed. It felt like all the wires in my head had been fried, like a fuse had gone haywire. But I knew there was one thing I could do that would make it all better. Climbing from the car, I walked slowly to the house, heedless of the rain. I didn't step inside, but only opened the door far enough to catch Mom's attention. She was pulling something out of the freezer that looked like a bag of frozen meatballs. I have to go do something, Mom, I said. My tone of voice was normal, which kind of surprised me. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's important. She looked up from the bag in her hand. Something in my tone or face must have let her know how serious it was, because she didn't say anything. She just looked outside at the falling rain. You'll get sick if you stay outside too long. Try to hurry. I nodded and turned away, but she called my name. I glanced back. I hope one day you can tell me what's going on, Abby. I'm worried, really worried for you. Tears filled my eyes and I looked at her, trying to show her what I couldn't say at the moment. She took a step toward me, her eyes wide, but I turned away and let the door slam shut behind me. Mom couldn't help me right now. Only one person could. The rain pounded down and I lifted my head to let it wash over me. I didn't care if I was soaking wet. My jacket would cover my body, but as far as my face and hair, I just didn't care. I kept my pace slow and steady, with my chosen destination in mind. I tried to work everything out in my head, but I still couldn't think clearly. It was like trying to read a book with numbers instead of letters. I couldn't make sense out of anything. In time I came to that large iron fence marking the entryway, and I took the familiar path, running now as I went farther and farther along. Every pounding footstep echoed the sound of my heart against my chest, a pattern that went round and round inside my head. Please be here, it chanted. I didn't stop running when Irving's plot came into view, but kept right on going toward the river. My feet slid on the wet, muddy trail, but I kept pushing forward. I had to find him. I had to know now. Before I even realized it, my mouth started sounding out the words echoing in my brain. Please be here. Please be here. I panted, trying to pace myself. Rounding the downward slope that led to the old Dutch church and Crane River, I stayed my course. The river came into sight. I slowed to a walk when I finally reached its rocky bank. Skidding my way down it, I looked the entire area over, but he wasn't there. I threw my head back and howled out my frustration to the wind. Where am I going to find him? Something quiet inside caught hold and told me to shut up and paid attention. I pushed heavy hunks of wet hair away from my eyes and immediately calmed my breathing. Then I stood very still. After exhaling once, I breathed in deeply and turned toward the bridge again. A dark figure was leaning up against the concrete pillar, almost blending in completely. I knew without a doubt that my search was over. I took off running and came to a halt under the safety of the bridge, only a foot away from him. He looked surprised to see me. Abby, what? Why haven't you kissed me again? I interrupted. Since that day in the library? It was real, right? I didn't make it up, did I? He didn't say anything, and I took a step closer. Now I was only six inches away from him. Is it because you don't want to? Silence again. Or because you can't? He took a step away and I matched it, suddenly wanting the confrontation. I talked to Nicholas and Katie. They had some interesting things to say. Like how they think they're really characters from the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I gave an exaggerated laugh at the absurdity. Nicholas thinks he's supposed to be the headless horseman who fell in love with Katie, which is short for Katrina as in Van Tassel, while he was a ghost. Pretty crazy stuff. How much did you know about it? I stared him down, waiting for a reaction. That would explain a couple of things about them, he said quietly. Then louder, I didn't know any more than you. I swear, Abby. What about you then, Caspian, I asked. What's your last name? Your real last name? He looked at me but didn't answer. I felt like stepping up to him and poking him while I enunciated every single word. My mom and I stopped at an auto body shop today, I began. Met a man whose name was Bill. I also found a White Plains yearbook there from 2.5 years ago. Funny thing though, there's no one named Caspian Crane in there. Only a Caspian vendor. His look told me everything, and I stumbled back, almost falling. It's true then? I whispered. But how? Why? He ran his hands through his hair. A gesture that I'd once found endearing was now heartbreaking. I don't know why, Abby. I don't even really know how. All I know is that I'm here, and you're here, and somehow... He didn't finish. But you're dead. You said you were in a car crash. I put one hand up to my mouth to stifle a sob, but it was a pointless act. No use trying to hold back a tidal wave with a single bag of sand. He nodded, and pain filled his eyes. I don't believe you, I said fiercely. Everyone in this whole entire town has gone crazy, and I'm the only sane person left. I don't know why that man said that today, but I don't believe him. And I don't believe you. I pointed an accusing finger at him. He held out one hand. Abby, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out this way. I had hoped that we could find a way to... I don't know. And then I thought it might be better if I tried to make you stay away from me, but I tried not to look into his eyes. That was too overwhelming right now. Is your last name Vander? I asked him. He nodded once. Then why did you tell me it was Crane? He looked out over the water next to us, rolling and swirling under the relentless onslaught of rain. For some reason I was drawn to this river. One day, early last year, I saw you and Kristen here at the cemetery, and ever since then, it's become kind of my refuge, has brought me some sense of peace. So when you asked me my name, it just sort of came out that way. I couldn't look at him. And the rest, if that was your father? Was that all true? I addressed my questions to the river. I didn't want to see his face. I don't know, he whispered. I've seen the newspaper articles, but I can't remember anything. It's all black. All I know is that I'm drawn to this place and to you. You're so beautiful. Everywhere you go, I see these colors. You're the only one. I turned to face him now. Maybe it's not really true then, I said eagerly. I mean, maybe you just had a concussion or something, and that's why you have the no memory part. Or maybe they got the ID wrong. He shook his head. Abby, no. But you don't know, I screamed at him. You just don't know. He stepped closer until he was right next to me. Take my hand, he commanded softly. I looked at him incredulously. What? Take my hand, he said again. I sighed and reached out to touch him, but my finger slipped right through. I backed up, out into the rain, horrified. "What did you do?" I screeched, dancing perilously close to the edge of hysterics. "Why did you do that?" "That's how it is, Abby," he said. "That's just how it is." Now I was shaking my head frantically back and forth. It felt like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Something was broken in my head. Some sort of wire was messed up. "What about that night in my room?" I demanded, trying to cling to some small thread of sanity. "You touched my face, and at the library I held your hand and kissed you, and you kissed me back, damn it. So do whatever you did then now." I was sailing beyond hysterical breakdown, clear on through to pissed off and angry. He walked closer to me, and he was just under the edge of the bridge. "I can't do it again, Abby. That's why I've stayed away from you. It was only for one day. That day specifically." I stepped back under the safety of the bridge. "Do it again," I said. "Let me see you do it again." I held out my hand and depositioned his arm directly above it. Then he swung down. My eyes boggled and jumped out of my skull as I watched his entire arm pass through mine. Then he brought it up and did it again. I only felt the barest wisp of a tingle each time he passed through me. "Enough," I gasped, bending over to put my hands on my head. It was throbbing, and that same explosion of feeling was happening at the base of my neck again. "Now do you see, Abby?" Caspian asked. "Do you understand why I had to stay away?" My head exploded, sending a temporary dark spot over my left eyeball. When it cleared, I stumbled to my feet and backed out into the rain again. Holding both arms in front of me, I used them as a shield to ward him off. Then the pain to my heart came. It was a brutal, searing pain, so strong that it made me drop to my knees and retch. Heaving again and again, I vomited until there wasn't anything left, my body shuddering and convulsing. When the worst of it had passed, I crawled to the edge of the river. Paying no attention to my clothes or the brackish taste in my mouth, I dipped into that cool, rushing water and gargled. Soft noises behind me told me that Caspian had followed me out, but he hung back. I gathered my heavy, sodden hair into one hand and twisted it to the side before getting to my feet. I was completely soaked, but I didn't pay any attention to it. "Just tell me one thing," I whispered through a sore throat as I turned to face him. Tears spilled out, and I struggled to regain my composure. "That night in my room and the next day at the library, were you going to tell me that you love me?" He shook his head, but didn't answer. I waited and looked deeply into his eyes. "At least give me the dignity of an answer, Caspian," I cried when several minutes had passed. "You owe me that much." He looked away and then back at me again. When he spoke, each word was heavy and full of agony, as if they were being pulled from the very depths of his soul. "Of course I don't love you, Abby. I don't have a soul. I don't know what this feeling is, but it's not love. It can't be." "But I love you," I said brokenly. And with that confession, I turned back to him and walked away. Epilogue. I walked calmly, slowly toward Nicholas and Katrina's house with only one thought in my mind. I must have hit my knee on a rock when I'd fallen into the rain, because each step was agony. Shooting pain radiated up from my kneecap, and I started to favor it, adopting a limping gait. Every breath that I took along the way felt like sandpaper sawing away at my lungs, and I couldn't stop myself from crying. After a while, there simply weren't any more tears left, and my body just sort of shuddered every now and then. But still I limped on. When their door finally came into view and I had made my way up to it, I banged for all I was worth. I didn't stop, but just kept on banging. Nicholas was the one to answer. "Just tell me one thing," I said hoarsely while he stood in front of me. "Just one thing. How did you know about Caspian if he didn't know about you?" Nicholas opened his mouth to speak, but Katrina stood up next to him and put her hand on his arm. "We saw the black streak in his hair, dear, and Maxim is one of us. A shade." I put up my hands to cover my ears. I didn't want to hear their words. So what? I cried. He's a ghost, you're a ghost. Is Kristen a ghost too? Is she hiding somewhere around here? Where is she? Tell me. I need to see her again. Nicholas reached out for me, but I took a step back. I'm very sorry to add to your pain, Abby, he said, but Kristen is not one of us. She truly is dead. I saw her, but I could not help her. His words didn't make any sense, but I shook my head and turned away to go back to the path once more. I couldn't stay and ask them to explain it all. Nothing made sense anymore. Inspiration hit while I was limping my way out of the forest, and I pulled out my cell phone to check the time. It was 5:11. I could still make it. Forcing my weak knee to bear my weight, I picked up my pace to a slow jog. 18 minutes later, I found myself panting for breath on the library steps. After checking the time on my phone once again, I opened the door and headed straight for the front desk. I need to look up some White Plains newspapers from 2.5 years ago, right after Halloween, I blurted out. Mrs. Walker was on duty and she looked at me with concerned eyes. Abby, are you okay? Do you need to use the first aid kit or anything? I glanced down at myself. I was a total mess. Oh no, Mrs. Walker, I'm okay. The lie rolled off my tongue easily. I just remembered a last-minute school project, so I ran to get in here in time before you closed. I tripped on the way and then it started to rain and, well, I just really need to see those newspapers. She reluctantly agreed and led me to a smaller computer room in the back of the library. Every newspaper article from the surrounding 5 counties is archived online here, she told me before leaving. Just put in your search parameters and hit enter. And if you need anything at all, you let me know. She gave me a stern glare and I nodded meekly. Once I heard the door shut behind her, I took a seat and typed in White Plains Ledger November 1st to November 3rd. I found what I was looking for in the November 2 issue on page C17. Evening edition. A local Sleepy Hollow boy was pronounced dead on the scene earlier today in a fatal car crash. Caspian Wender, a recent graduate of White Plains High School. A loud buzzing sound filled my ears and I stopped reading. In the November 3rd edition, they had his obituary with a fuzzy black and white picture of him. I recognized this black streak right away. I was still staring at the screen an hour later when Mrs. Walker found me rocking by myself back and forth. She called my parents and stayed up with me, talking softly until Dad came to pick me up. He didn't ask me what was wrong or why I was acting like a complete nutjob, but carefully helped me down the stairs and into the car. Right before we made the final turn toward home, he paused at the stop sign for an extra minute and waited. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what he wanted. I need help, Dad, I whispered, turning to him. I can't deal with... My voice broke. I think I just need some help right now. He nodded once and put an arm around my shoulder. I'll take care of it. I withdrew, curling myself up into a tiny ball huddled in the far corner of the seat and rocked back and forth slightly until we arrived home. Dad helped me inside the house and Mom led me straight up to my room. She tucked me into bed like she used to when I was younger and I fell asleep quickly. It was a blissful relief to escape from the real world, even if it was only for a little while. In my dream, the rain was falling all around me, but I stayed under the protection of a tall tree. As soon as each drop hit, tiny blue flowers immediately sprang up, and the ground was awash in a profusion of blossoms. Kristen came gliding up the path, and the flowers parted for her, guiding the way. She was wearing a red cloak with a hood that hid her face. When she knelt in front of the tombstone and laid her fingers upon it, the raindrops rose, turning to hard pellets of ice that struck with a harsh pinging sound. The flowers withered and browned, dying in front of my very eyes. I wanted to say something to her, yet I didn't know what. I tried to take a step out from under that tree, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the ground. It was only then that I could see the letters spelling out her name as she traced each one. Over and over again she followed those etched words on that stone. Over and over again I tried to speak. But I was mute. Suddenly the ice stopped, the flowers bloomed again, and Kristen turned to me. Don't worry, Abby, she said. I'll still be here when you get back. I'll always be here. Special arrangements were made over the next week for me to leave school early, and all of the teachers agreed to give me my assignments for the rest of the school year to take with me. It had been decided that I would go stay with Aunt Marjorie and spend some time away from Sleepy Hollow due to health reasons. I think Dad was relieved I'd finally asked him for help, and he went out of his way to make sure that I would be seeing the best psychiatrist in the tri-state region. All it required on my part was a session twice a week for the next 4 months, and I'd be back in time for summer vacation with no one the wiser. That part relieved Mom. As far as I was concerned, I was willing to do whatever it took to fix what had gone wrong inside my brain. I didn't care if that involved a psychiatrist, a psychic healer, or a voodoo priestess. All I wanted was to be sane again. When the morning that I was scheduled to leave home came, I found myself in a daze. I walked out to the car stiffly and climbed in. Everything around me felt surreal, like I was disconnected. I asked Dad to stop at the cemetery before we left town, and he agreed, keeping watch from the car when we got there. Pausing for a moment at the entrance gate, I let my hand rest on the cold metal and turned back. I'll be right back. Thanks for waiting, Dad. He nodded once, and I turned toward my destination. I walked solemnly most of the way there, but my determination gave in when I reached the stone steps, and I flung myself up them. After pushing through the gate, I dropped to my knees in front of Washington Irving's marker. I'm leaving. It was blunt and to the point, the only way I knew how to get all the words out. Things are just too much for me to handle right now, and I have to leave for a while. Reaching out a hand to touch the carved dates, I forced myself to go on. I'll come back. It's not forever, but I need some time to get myself fixed. I laughed quietly. You wouldn't believe the head trip I've been on the last couple of weeks. I stood up. You know, I said thoughtfully, you're the one person in my life who's the most real to me, and you're dead. That's funny. I left the graveyard behind me. I got back into the car, and Dad pulled away from Sleepy Hollow. I guess I should have been thinking about all I was leaving behind. Or the fact that I was possibly in the middle of a nervous breakdown, and how I was going to see a professional, because my problems were so huge that I couldn't sort them out myself. Yet all I could think of was that red hair dyeing incident with Kristen. It was funny.